When it comes to how the West talks about China, you might be feeling a bit of whiplash. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, Western politicians competed over who could sound the toughest on China.
They are the single greatest currency manipulator that's ever been on this planet.
I spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader had by the time we left office. This is a guy who doesn't have a democratic with a small d bone in his body. This is a guy who is a thug who, in fact, has 1 million Uyghurs in reconstruction camps, meaning concentration camps.
China is a systemic rival when it comes to the way they look at the individual and human rights.
We have to learn from the mistakes we made of Europe becoming dependent on Russian oil and gas. We cannot allow that to happen with China. And freedom is a price worth paying.
But what we do need to do is acknowledge that China is a threat to our national security. It's a threat to our economic security.
So what you saw there, sort of going through those clips, finding those clips, what I found so interesting is how it was an issue in electoral contests. So sort of the Democratic primaries there, Donald Trump before a general election, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss there, where you had to compete to sound the toughest on China. That's where politics was going between 2016 and, say, 2023, 2024. However, fast forward a couple of years, and now Western leaders are queuing up to go to Beijing.
French President Emmanuel Macron then heading to China, due to land very shortly, in fact, for a 3-day state visit.
Mr. Prime Minister, a historic moment not seen for almost a decade. A Canadian Prime Minister alongside China's President in the Great Hall of the People.
At the Great Hall of the People, the first British Prime Minister to visit in 8 years was welcomed. The governments of both China and the UK have decided that relations had been in the cold for too long, and now the thaw is well and truly on.
So what caused this thaw, which we'll even see Donald Trump visit Beijing in April? Well, one person who saw the rethink in the West coming is Kaiser, host of one of my favourite podcasts, Sinica. I do really recommend it. I've been listening to it for about a decade now. In February last year, he predicted, or I suppose he kind of recognised that a China vibe shift was incoming. In October last year, he wrote that China's success in multiple fields was causing a great reckoning in the US and other Western nations. As I say, Kaiser, one of my favourite thinkers on China, and I caught up with him earlier today. Kaiser Guo, thank you so much for joining me on Novara Live.
Thanks for having me back, Michael.
So, as far as I know, I think you coined the China vibe shift early last year. You were early to it. Tell me about why you saw a China vibe shift coming in early 2025 and what you think has happened since then.
Yeah, it's been a hell of a year. A year ago, of course, we had a couple of things in quick succession. We had the DeepSeek moment, right? So explosion out of the scene of this Chinese-developed LLM that, for a much, much, much lower training cost, the lower token cost, was able to perform on par with a lot of the frontier models in the United States. That was a big shock. That was followed immediately by this really kind of strange episode where you had this exodus of people from TikTok, which was under threat of being actually banned in the waning days of the Biden administration, onto a Chinese app. They did it all very, ironically, very tongue-in-cheek, fleeing, onto a Chinese app. You don't want us on Chinese apps? Well, we'll show you a good one without even an English interface on it. It was called Red Note or Xiaohongshu. And then, you had a bunch of social media influencers like iShowSpeed and people like that, a huge guy on YouTube, going to China and, getting sort of China-pilled, singing the praises of all the infrastructure and the high-speed rails and the EVs and all that. And something switched, something flipped in sort of the American popular consciousness. And suddenly it was sort of cool to dig China. And it seems to have culminated late last year in this very strange meme where, people were saying, you're finding me at a very Chinese time in my life right now. It was this thing where people were, putting on slippers in the morning and stretching and drinking hot water and eating congee and then sort of discovering all these self-care practices of Chinese people. Again, it was done sort of, ironically, but I mean, it means something. I think that even these strange little cultural artifacts, they add up. So yeah, there seems to have been this popular shift. But I think what's more interesting though is that it was reflected in an official narrative. I mean, even globally, the same sort of disaffection with America, with the Trump administration, that drove a lot of these people to feel like they were, they had been gaslit by the mainstream media on China. We're suddenly, say, hey, China actually seems to have its shit together, and yeah, there's a lot of breathless nonsense as well, of course, and some of it I'm sure people will come to regret. But the interesting thing is, what we've seen now with Mark Carney's visit to China, then his, rupture speech at Davos. We've seen now, Keir Starmer, even as we're speaking right now, is still in Beijing. And we're seeing a lot of this. Quite a number of European leaders sort of lined up in this hedging strategy vis-a-vis the United States and China. So a lot of it is American push, coupled with Chinese pull.
Trump does play a really significant role, I suppose, both in the turn to a hawkishness towards China and now this dovishness towards China, because I mean, it was Donald Trump, I think, who in 2015 in his primary campaign and then in the 2016 election campaign sort of really shifted the American approach to China to the right. So you had him sort of saying China's the biggest enemy, these deficits we're running with China are terrible. And then by 2020, the Democrats had basically taken that on. So you had in the Democratic primary sort of Joe Biden calling Xi Jinping a thug. And it seemed like Trump had really shifted the whole West's approach actually to China, because obviously, where Washington leads, London, Paris, they follow, right? But now it is Trump's sort of unstable leadership, which now seems to have pushed everyone back to China. So to what extent is the West's relationship to China, does it have actually nothing really to do with China at all, and it's all about Donald Trump?
I think that's a big piece of it. Obviously, it's a piece that can't be ignored. I'd push back a little bit on how you described how things played out. Trump certainly did pull American hawkishness. I mean, he certainly did have a huge role to play in that, especially the sort of more, morally panic type, the more unhinged type, the purely xenophobic or racial-based, especially after the COVID outbreak. So, we saw him go full tilt in 2020. But during the first, before the first Trump administration, even by 2014, 2015, it was pretty obvious, even in the waning years of the Obama administration. I don't doubt for a second that had Hillary Clinton taken the presidency in 2016, she would have come into office in January of 17, and we would have seen an equally strident, equally hawkish policy toward China. It would have been, more along the lines of what we saw during the Biden administration, more about, sort of alliances and that sort of thing. But I think that China certainly wouldn't have felt any more comfortable with it. It would have been, they would have seen it as just another chapter in the long story of containment. I don't know how to apportion how much of it is due to Trump, but certainly a huge piece of it is just, the world recoiling from just the complete, ad hocery of Trump foreign policy.
When Biden was president and America seemed like a kind of reliable ally to the West, Biden was trying to hold back China's development of AI and all sorts of technology, and sort of building this alliance of the democracies versus the autocracies, as they said. Obviously, there was lots of hypocrisy there because the Democratic Alliance included Saudi Arabia and countries like that. But there we are. But that was the Biden approach, and Britain and other countries were happy to go along with it. Now you've got Donald Trump, and I suppose how countries see other countries is relative, isn't it? So now the Americans seem like a terrible ally. You've got all of these Western countries now lining up to go to Beijing, Keir Starmer, Macron, and others. So that's, I suppose it's quite easy to see that narrative. To what extent has anything changed in China? Because I suppose the shift to hawkishness in the late 2010s, there was always an argument that, yes, it was partly sort of concocted by the Americans who, due to sort of imperial competition, wanted to rally the troops against China. But then people would also argue, actually, this also reflects a real change in China. China has, under Xi Jinping, become more authoritarian. It has intensified its repression of the Uyghurs. It has, done a clampdown in Hong Kong. So to pretend that this was all moral panic ignores the real changes that were going on in China. I don't know where you stand on that, but then also whether this shift we're now seeing is because, I don't think China's liberalized. So I suppose, talk to me about how the shift to hawkishness and now dovishness, to what extent that does reflect real changes within China, or if it's all just about changes in the international scene.
Again, I think it's just, hard to apportion cause for this exactly. I personally do not think that China's, nefarious behavior, that all these things that you've rattled off really add up to make America's moral panic an appropriate response. I think that it's still totally out of proportion to what we've seen. We've seen worse from other actors that hasn't induced that same sort of panic. I think the moral failings of the Chinese authorities, such as they are, assumed a much, they grew in our eyes precisely because we felt this sort of threat from this near-peer multidimensional competitor. There was a fundamental challenge to this long-held idea of American primacy. China had knocked out one after another of the sort of axiomatic pillars, these assumptions that we've long had about American exceptionalism, and I think it caused us to inflate the threat. And there was a lot of, and to inflate our sense of indignation at these at China's supposed perfidy. In things like you're talking about in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang. I think that, in the grand scheme of things, that these were not worth the level of stridency that we saw, the formation of this, House Select Committee on U.S. competition with the Chinese Communist Party, that sort of thing. So yeah, there's part of it is, but it's been wildly blown out of proportion. As for whether China has changed or liberalized, no, absolutely not. It has not. I think what it has done is it's probably realized that you can attract more flies with honey than with vinegar. They've turned on the charm offensive a little bit. I've happened to know that there have been some coordinated efforts to bring in cooperation with technology companies and things like that, to bring influential YouTubers and that sort of thing. Michael, I don't know if you've been issued an invitation yet, but to come over and live stream from China, they sort of know. Call it propaganda or whatever, but Chinese propaganda, I think, has really upped its game. They've sort of understood now that you can probably do a little bit more by doing less. That is, by giving people sort of the wherewithal to run around with their cameras, rather than just shepherding them along, through this obvious Potemkin village tour, right? So, yeah, I think they've improved their ability to do this. But also, Chinese people have just sort of gotten a lot more confident. I think that coming out of COVID, after the kind of trauma of the lockdown, we're seeing that kind of confidence bounce back, and confidence is an attractive quality, and people pick up on it.
It's funny you mention it, actually. I was invited on an influencer tour of China last year. I was tempted because it looked like a good trip. I wanted to go to China for ages, but I spoke to some friends and they said, go off your own back. So I'm going in April, but I'm paying for the tickets myself and my accommodation myself. So in an article you published last October called The Great Reckoning, so the argument you're making is that people in the past in the recent past, had said, yes, China is rising, but they sort of had some cope that came along with it. It's an authoritarian state, which means that it can never really get to the technological frontier. They're fixing the statistics. It might look like they're growing, but actually this is just communist propagandists saying that growth is faster than it actually is. But now, people are visiting China, they're seeing the infrastructure. China is competing on the technological frontier, DeepSeek and the like. So finally, people, the cope can't continue anymore. People are realizing that China is here, it is a peer competitor, and it's going to remain that way. I suppose my question to you is, at what point will we know if China is the world's leading power? You're saying it's not playing catch up anymore. But I suppose militarily, America is still the leading power, in terms of the number of sort of bases it has around the world. But when do you think we would know if China had supplanted the United States as the premier power in the world?
Well, first of all, that seems to assume that China aspires to supplant the United States as a premier power. I don't think that argument is necessarily, I don't take that for granted at all. Maybe one marker that would suggest to me that we have already arrived at a moment where they are peers was earlier in the fall when the U.S. rolled out a news just before the October 1st holiday in China, rolled out these expansions to technology export controls based on what they call the subsidiary rule, so that companies that were subsidiaries of entities that were already on the entity list would then fall under the entity listing rulings themselves and would not be able to import certain technology or technological products from the United States or products containing U.S. IP. That was a huge, huge thing for China, and then China fought back, right, by rolling out these rare earth elements export restrictions. And what happened then? That was, when it sort of showed that this interdependence could be weaponized by both sides and weaponized very effectively by China. And Donald Trump ate another taco meal. It was, he blinked, right? Very, very much blinked. And we ended up with the Busan sort of peace treaty, not a peace treaty, but at least a ceasefire. That, I think, was a really signal moment. And it really, I think it did show that, in the past, if you look at the first Trump administration, as recently as that, China did have to blink.
I'm interested in this idea that you said, that China isn't interested in being the dominant power. And I suppose, I'm not hawkish on China when sort of people say China is, it's intent on dominating the world, we have to isolate it. I'm not particularly convinced. But there is an argument that sort of once you do become the richest, most powerful state in the world, sort of a desire to then begin to control things beyond your borders is almost inevitable. There was a period where the United States was saying, well, let's try isolationism. But that ended. And is it not the case that if sort of China continues on this path to becoming, the wealthiest, most economically powerful state in the world, that it will inevitably start to see that it has sort of interests beyond its borders, which it now has the capacity to protect? I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's one theory of history that I suspect is largely projection. Just because, that's what we do, that's sort of part of our psychology, the Americans or whatever. We assume that anyone who's in that position will make that same decision. I don't know that. I think that China is actually, from my dealings with the card-carrying strategic class in Beijing, they seem like their ambitions are a little more modest. They certainly don't think that the world is lining up to buy into this ideology that they very, with great branding savvy, have called Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Is that the ideology that they're going to rule the world with? I don't think so. I think that China's exceptionalism is very particularist, whereas the United States really does seem to believe that its values and its institutions are true for all people in all times, that they are truly universal. China's exceptionalism is strange. It's very particular. It sort of feels like it is China's institutions and values are very much the product of its specific historical circumstances. It's the peculiarities of its resource endowment, of its constraints and everything, and it also it sort of feels like while the rest of the world sure is welcome to come and learn from the great Chinese civilization and take away what it can, it's not going to proselytize. It's not going to push its vision out into the world. Will it have interests beyond its borders that it wants to protect? Absolutely. I mean, and it does. But, I think we've already seen sort of early signs of it. It didn't do anything in Venezuela. It probably won't do anything in Iran, even if it comes to, the United States launching some sort of an attack. I mean, it's not just a matter of capability, and that's a big question too, but also just of what it sees as strategically valuable.
On this point of sort of the system in China, you had a phrase in your article, which you just mentioned, which I found interesting. I wanted to ask you about. So you said the system powering China's success is an extraordinary, intricate alloy of Confucianism, Leninism, technocratic authoritarianism, state capitalism, and market mechanisms. Now, on this show, especially sort of when it's myself and my colleague Aaron, we're often sort of debate and talk about Leninism, technocratic authoritarianism, state capitalism, and market mechanisms. We don't talk about Confucianism because, frankly, we don't know much about it. So I wondered if I assume this is actually quite a broad question, but if you could give just a brief introduction of what you mean when you say sort of Confucianism is a part of the intricate alloy of China's success. What is Confucianism?
Yeah, so Confucius, Confuzi, was a sage who was a sort of private teacher who lived from 551 to 479 BC in China. And his legacy, because of his many students and because, he was so revered, Confucianism, such as this, became sort of the operating system for imperial China from the Han Dynasty through pretty much the end of the Qing Dynasty. It fell into great disfavor, in the period that we call the May 4th movement, the New Culture movement, when there was a period of really kind of cultural iconoclasm where they decided that the reason that China was so backward and unable to modernize was all because of Confucianism. Confucianism itself is a profoundly conservative ideology. In a real literal sense, it is sort of anti-innovation. It believes that all the best ideas and the perfect society was in the past, in the early years of the Zhou dynasty in like the 11th century BC. That's where Confucius saw his golden age, what we should go back to. So he was all about preserving the rituals of that time, the familial relations. He takes this idea of the family as a metaphor for the state to an extreme. So it's a very familialistic, it's very paternalistic, it's a deeply sexist, very illiberal tradition in many ways, but it is also a deeply humanistic tradition. So there's the good and the bad, and by no means is Xi Jinping or any of the people who've come before him sort of taking on Confucianism the whole hog. They've picked and chosen. They found pieces of it that they think support the goals of the state, the ideas of the state, and those are mainly it's very kind of, ironically, because it sits uncomfortably next to Marxism, because it's if anything it's the most anti-class war ideology ever. It's all about social harmony. It's not to the point of caste system or anything like that, but it's all about sort of harmony and hierarchy.
Respecting your superiors, I suppose, is that sort of following tradition that's respecting your superiors?
That's definitely a part of it.
Let's bring a hawk into the discussion. So I suppose the vibe shift you're talking about is sort of cultural and then also political, economic to some degree as well. Firms now talking very openly about how, of course, we have to be in China, where they might have kept that a little bit quiet a couple of years ago. Somewhere where Cold War rhetoric is still strong, though, as far as I can tell, is Silicon Valley, or at least parts of it. So I want to show a clip of Anthropic's Dario Amodei speaking earlier this week.
If this technology is dangerous, we should not be selling it to our authoritarian adversaries. We should not be selling to the Chinese Communist Party the resources to build a totalitarian surveillance state with this technology.
Are you talking about the chips in NVIDIA? Is that along those same lines?
Yeah. Look. I mean, these chip makers are trying to do the best they can for the country, and I think they're doing what they can to run their business. But I'm not sure it's in the national security interest of the United States or other democracies, to sell these chips to countries that can build a totalitarian surveillance state and contend with us militarily.
What do you make of that? I mean, Dario Amodei, he has an interest, I suppose, in trying to lobby for export controls of chips to Chinese firms because they are competitors of Anthropic, his firm. But he is also making an argument that, I'm sure lots of people genuinely believe, which is that China isn't a democracy. They do quite a lot of surveillance. I suppose we do as well, but presumably we have a few more checks and balances in a sort of liberal democracy than they do in China. And so letting them get ahead of us in the AI race could be dangerous. I mean, that presumes they're not already ahead of us. But I don't know. What do you think? What would your response be to Dario Amodei there?
I guess I would respond to that with a question of my own, which is what happened to you, Dario? From I think it was November of 2014 to October of 2015, he worked for Baidu. It happens that I, at that same time, also worked for Baidu. He was in the Silicon Valley research lab working on AI stuff. He was, as I understand it, instrumental in bringing the sort of, they called it deep speech 2. It was able to, understand and transcribe speech in Mandarin and a bunch of other different languages. Very, very, very advanced for its time. I don't know under what auspices he left, under what conditions. Nobody told me. I don't think we ever actually met one another. I wasn't spending a lot of time in the Silicon Valley office. I was over in Beijing. But I don't know what happened to him. What caused him to turn so abruptly and to decide that this country that, one of whose companies, one of whose flagship companies he was happy to work for, was suddenly a national adversary and couldn't be trusted with the sorts of technologies he was helping to develop. I don't share that fear. I don't at all. In fact, I think that if anything, that kind of distrust tends to create exactly the kinds of behaviors that we're hoping to avoid. I think this is really, really counterproductive. That look, this is the kind of thing that I hear from people whose next utterance would be, wouldn't it be terrible if China were to cure cancer? It's like this, technological advances for good or for evil could only be our domain. We cannot allow this nefarious other to possess these technologies, no matter what. That's obviously I profoundly disagree with him on this.
The vibe shift when it comes to China, I think clearly, as we've spoken about, one of the reasons on the international scene and with sort of political leadership in the West and elsewhere in the world is that people value stability. And especially compared to the United States, China seems to offer stability. You know what its policy is going to be in a couple of years' time. You even, in America, you don't know what their policy is going to be in a couple of weeks' time with Donald Trump. That won't necessarily last forever, though. And the problem, the most obvious problem when you look at China in terms of what's it going to be like in 10, 20, 30 years is they don't have a clear mechanism for succession. And it seems like they still haven't solved that problem, right? Xi Jinping is getting on in years. It seems very unclear who's going to replace him. Might we, in 5 or 10 years' time, look back at how we're discussing China now, where sort of, the suggestion is they've solved these problems. People thought that you couldn't have economic growth with authoritarianism. People thought that you couldn't have sort of modernization and a growing middle class without having some form of liberalization. And China has proved that all wrong. But maybe they haven't, because it could be that in 5 or 10 years' time, we think, oh, actually, yeah, all those things we thought were true. It's just that Xi Jinping managed to hold it off for a while. And the moment that the succession fails, the whole thing could collapse. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, it's possible. Of course it is. It's just that what I would urge people against is, overweighting that. That becomes that sort of coaching, that coping crutch exactly the sort of thing that I'm hoping to head off in the essay that I wrote. There's a lot of this sort of belief in authoritarian brittleness ends up doing an awful lot of work for us. So we ought, I think, be very, very careful about depending on that. It's certainly not a strategy, sort of await the inevitable collapse. I think it is a problem. I think that if we see it as a problem, I think the odds are that China recognizes it as such too. As with all these other things, it's not like China is unaware of its looming demographic crisis. It's not like the Chinese leadership is unaware of flaccid consumption. It's not unaware of the problem that's being generated by having $1.2 trillion in trade surplus in 2025. I mean, it's aware of these things, and I can assure you that this is the sort of thing that's keeping them up at night. I don't pretend that I have better answers than they do. I think they think about it a whole lot more. I have a lot more smarter people thinking about it. So not that I have blind trust that they'll figure everything out. But I think the odds are, just looking at their track record, they're pretty good at muddling through.
Let's talk about, I suppose, comparisons between China and the West, because again, on this show, something we're often talking about is why liberal democracy now seems so brittle. And I suppose there's often three causes put forward, and people sort of choose them partly depending on their prior political sort of commitments. But what people put forward to say why liberal democracy doesn't seem so healthy anymore is slow growth, social media, and sort of the polarization that it brings, the gatekeepers being removed, and immigration. And when I was thinking about this today, thinking those are the three issues that people say has made liberal democracy in the West brittle. It does seem remarkable that China has kind of avoided all three. So they still have growth. Yes, it's slowed because they've got an aging population, but still 5% or so. They have very little immigration, and they have put huge guardrails on social media. So should we, I suppose, grant them that the leadership had remarkable foresight when it came to what are the destabilizing forces in society and how to avoid them?
Yeah, I would be hesitant about saying, chalking this up to great foresight. I mean, they're not clairvoyant. They don't see into the future. Look, I think it was obvious that something like social media was going to be disruptive, socially destabilizing in some way, leading to the level of political polarization that we've seen today. I don't know if anyone, foresaw that. I don't think they saw the alt-right rising out of 4chan and 8chan and things like that, that are described in Ellie Reeves' book Black Pill, which is very good. I think that China was nervous. You have to remember, okay, the advent of social media, its appearance on the scene, 2006, 2007, 2008, sort of coincides with these color revolutions that China was really worried about. You'll recall, Putin's Munich Security Conference speech in 2007. By 2008, 2009, there was this idea abroad that, you really couldn't turn on the news or open a newspaper without seeing this idea that the digital revolution, and especially social media, was going to bring down authoritarian regimes all over the world, right? And I've often said that, during these color revolutions, and especially during the Arab Spring, we were in the West gleefully appending the names of American social media products to the names of these revolutions, right? We had all these Twitter revolutions in Moldova and whatnot. We had, in Iran in 2009, that was the YouTube revolution, and the Facebook revolution in Tahrir Square in 2012 or whatever. It was sure that China was going to start looking at these products really askance. It's significant that they were blocked really in the aftermath of major social upheavals that China believed smelled like color revolution. So in Tibet in 2008, in March of 2008, and in Xinjiang in July of 2009, that's when you saw the wall come down on a lot of these American-led and even some Chinese homegrown social media products. So yeah, It's ironic. I mean, we had a year ago, we had all these people fleeing TikTok in spite of China's so-called censorship. We were, worried about China's manipulation of TikTok, and that's why we wanted to ban it, right? And so they fled to Xiaohongshu. Now, I don't know if you've watched the last couple of days, people are furious because the TikTok now, under American ownership, seems to have, learned the great firewall techniques. So you can't search, we couldn't search for Epstein or for ICE or Minneapolis or things like that. Your search results were coming up blank. There seemed to be pretty heavy-handed censorship. I don't know what the cause is. TikTok, they say that was some sort of glitch and it was they fixed it, but again, we saw another exodus of people and a lot of buzz talking about how, meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Kaiser Kuo, thank you so much for speaking again. Always interesting to have you on Novara Media.
Thank you very much for having me.